Thank you, Anthony, for the wonderful and embarrassing introduction. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thanks for thinking of me, for inviting me. Very honored and humbled. Je suis ravi d'être à Montréal. Très bien d'être ici. La conférence sera en anglais, mais pour les questions, s'il vous plaît, les deux, français et anglais, ça va. I will talk about early identification of risk or opportunity, if you want to. I'll focus on the major types of mental illness, major mood and psychotic disorders. And doing that, I'll show a little bit of work in progress, what we have been doing in Halifax and elsewhere over the last decade. I have nothing, at least nothing financial to disclose. I remember the first time I came here was actually almost exactly 10 years ago, and it was when Ashok was celebrating the 10 years. And it was such a wonderful opportunity because we were just setting up our shop, and I had the first few wonderful young people joining my team, and we could come here and hear about your first 10 years of experience. So now 10 years later. I'll talk about mood and psychotic disorders in terms of introduction. Inevitably, I'll talk about prevention because that's why we do prediction. In terms of predicting, I'll talk about family history, genetics, what we call antecedents, the early soft manifestations of mental health issues, biomarkers, and about bringing it all together. That's what the multivariate stands for, and I'll try to touch on what I feel the next directions may be, usually wrong, whoever tries to do it. In terms of my focus, we work with major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and psychotic disorders. These are the problems that keep most adult mental health services and adult psychiatrists busy. It's not all of mental health and illness by far, but they are the disorders that most often bring people to hospitals or lead to major breaks in life or stop people from completing qualifications or starting families. These three disorders are inevitably related. I say major depressive disorder is always a provisional diagnosis, especially in the early years, in the first few years after initial diagnosis. Approximately 1 in 4 cases of depression will turn at some point into bipolar disorder, and probably as much as 1 in 10 will become psychosis at some point. It's very well known that most cases of bipolar disorder start as depression, and there's typically several years between the first depressive episode and the first hypomanic or manic episode that actually enables the diagnosis of bipolar disorder. But once that established, bipolar disorder tends to be recurrent or persistent in very high percentage. That's in stark contrast to major depression, where when we look at people who develop the first episode, for half of them, this remains the only episode for a very long time, if not for the entirety of their life. Now, psychotic disorder, and this is schizophrenia and all the related ones, it may be less well known, but depression is probably also the most common initial presentation of psychosis. Among the prodromal services, we typically see between 20 and 40% of the people who fulfill the prodromal criteria for psychosis also have major depression, and that's a cross-section. When we look at the whole course of the prodrome, including the kind of about a year backwards, it's up to 80% who have met the criteria for major depressive disorder during the development. So Hans Hefner wrote about that, and in detail. And then recently, Rachel Upgroves summarized that evidence of how closely is depression related not just to bipolar disorder or to psychosis. So I firmly believe if we talk about early stages, we really need to either work with all of these or work closely with our colleagues who cover the other ones. Now, prevention and essentially our motivation to do all this work. You will have heard that prevention can be universal. Do something for everyone. In youth, we typically do something in schools or also around birth and maternity and early visiting with mothers and babies. And it tends to be spread out. And in many areas, such as substance use and related disorders, universal interventions have been very successful. The other types of prevention, we choose who we provide interventions for or who we offer interventions. And they are either selective, where we select a whole segment of population, let's say a neighborhood that's known to be at high risk because of socioeconomic circumstances, or offspring of people of parents living with mental disorders or other health predicaments. And finally, there's indicated prevention that we offer to people who already show some symptoms, some personal manifestations of illness. And because in psychiatry and elsewhere, we often mix the selecting on external factors and indicating on personal experiences, we need a common name for them. So we talk about targeted prevention that encompasses the selective and indicated. Essentially all types of prevention where we choose the individuals rather than offering it to everyone. In terms of the content and focus of prevention, it also varies from general health promotion, which typically tallies best with the universal approach, to transdiagnostic, trying to prevent multiple disorders, to very specific, trying to prevent, let's say, bipolar disorder specifically. And they all have their place, but we need to look at where we should invest the most. And I try to look to see where we can make the biggest difference. This meta-analysis of all intervention or preventive intervention studies for depression and anxiety disorders in children and youth is actually 7-year-old, but it's still the most comprehensive meta-analysis at this point. And Sarah Hetrick and others compared universal and targeted prevention. And the important feature about this meta-analysis, they separated immediate post-intervention short-term, which is less than a year, typically up to 6 months, and long-term, which is 1 year or longer outcomes. And for me, thinking of prevention, we're talking about lifetime of health or illness. 1 year doesn't feel particularly long-term. I'm not looking for changes in months, I'm looking for changes in years. So I really look at the long-term follow-up. And here, all summed up, whether the intervention is universal or targeted, they do have beneficial effects in the short term. And the effects are bigger for the targeted interventions per individual. It's probably also more expensive per individual, so it may be proportional. The effect size may be proportionate to the investment. But when we go to the long term and remind yourself that's just 1 year or longer, the effects of the universal interventions all but disappear. And the effects of the targeted interventions persist. And this, among other indications, persuaded me that we need to work on prediction so that we can target appropriately, so that we can make a difference that lasts. I'll turn to what's known about prevention of some of the specific disorders. And interestingly, it's very different stories. So when it comes to preventing bipolar disorder, the most interventions have looked at family-focused therapy and a few on cognitive behavioral group therapy. And they many of them show some improvement, especially short-term, in experiences and symptoms and quality of life, but none of them has demonstrated the reduction in actual onsets of bipolar disorder. For depression, it's kind of the story I have shown, much more of the kind of universal versus targeted approach, many kind of less intensive, shorter interventions. For psychosis, it's completely different story. The focus for 3 decades now has been at the prodrome or clinical high risk, at the stages immediately preceding onset. And that there have been some remarkable successes, including cognitive behavioral therapy possibly halving the rate of conversion to full rate psychosis over the next year to several years. But the flip side is that when we looked at measures of symptoms and quality of life, the changes are small in size, and the functional outcomes, completing qualifications, getting a job, starting a family, they remained poor even in the successes of those interventions. And the field is energized, and there's new things being tested, bringing in cognitive remediations, other parts of treatment. But this is where we are. So that brings me to the need to predict. People suggested various reasons, but the grand rule is there's no point in predicting and communicating risks unless at the same time we also provide the tools to mitigate or change the risk. People talked about minimizing avoidable risks, don't walk on the thin ice kind of approach. Monitor, pros and cons of proactive monitoring, but definitely the big reasons are targeted prevention and early treatment for those who are either at higher probability or already developing major mental illness. To answer the question about how well we can predict and how soon we can predict risk, of course, I look at the literature, and literature is getting bigger. So systematic reviewing is actually becoming a bigger part of what we do and what we have to do to actually contribute new knowledge. I'll talk also about a cohort that we've been working with for the last decade. We call it FORBO. And fortunately, also a consortium of cohorts, people from 8 countries coming together, bringing data together so that we can answer some questions that we could not individually. In terms of literature, we in the process of completing 2 systematic reviews, one looking at risk within families, what conditions in parents lead what degree of risk in children across all types of mental disorders. And we're looking at what we call antecedents, predictors at the individual level in prospective longitudinal studies. And I've drawn these in this talk. In terms of our cohort, FORBO stands for Families Overcoming Risks and Building Opportunities for Well-Being. I never used the long word. And there are 620 young people, children, adolescents, and young adults that we've been following up. And the average participant has already completed 5 annual follow-ups. So we have done over 3,000 follow-ups with these people. And we start to see some outcomes. The entry into FORBO for the majority is through a parent living with mental illness. So either parents living with depression, that's the largest group, parents living with bipolar disorder, somewhat smaller, parents living with schizophrenia is our numerically smallest group, and I'd say work in progress, as well as some so-called control parents, which are parents with children of similar age coming from either the same schools or same neighborhoods as our higher risk family offspring, which makes our control group on average socially at risk. Our control group is relatively less well off socioeconomically than the average person in Nova Scotia because of this matching at neighborhood level. Over these 3,200 person years, we have seen 86 onsets. 86 young people have developed major depression, bipolar disorder, or psychotic disorder that they did not have when they entered the cohort. And it's sad to see, and it also is an opportunity to look at what we know actually about the development, because many of them we have seen at multiple times before they developed the illness. For participants were on average 10 years old when they were starting. And the average age when they developed the disorder is 17, which is more than the average age of 15 of people in the cohort now. So we expecting to see many more onsets over the next couple of years. And most of the onsets so far have been of major depression. But based on what we know, we expect some of them to turn into other diagnoses. So we keep following them after that as well. Now the consortium, this is 8 cohorts joined together. It more than quadrupled our sample size. We had 600 young people in Forbo. We have 2,700 in the consortium brought together, mostly with very comparable assessments, at least when it comes to diagnoses and some core symptoms. And the initial impetus for doing this was for a genetic study. So of the 2,700, for nearly 2,000, about 1,900, we have genome-wide genetic data after quality control. Across this consortium, the average age at onset is 16, and there are nearly 700 of prospectively recorded onsets of depression, bipolar disorder, or psychosis, including 150 of bipolar disorder, and small number of psychosis and larger number of depression. And so the age of 16 is even a year younger than what we've seen in Forbo. And as you see in the graph on the right, that's the probability of onset among those the offspring of parents living with mental illness in red, and offspring of parents who don't have mental illness in blue. And you can see that the shape of those trajectories is very different. So it is the offspring of affected parents where the risk peaks in mid to late adolescence between age 15 and 17. In the offspring of unaffected parents, the risk actually continues to rise to in the early 20s. This is known in the literature, but perhaps just how big the difference is only coming up when we sum data across this number of people. It really brings me to the point that we need to see the development of mental illness in developmental perspective. This is my tracking, the thin red line in this case is my attempt to track the development of human ability. Think of cognition, social skills, all of that. You see rapid development in early childhood, and then another turmoil of a rapid development in adolescence. And I think it's no coincidence that the typical age at onset of serious forms of mental illness coincides with when the human potential is about to reach its peak. It's the threshold between adolescence and early adulthood where we most typically see onset of serious forms of mental illness. And depression, psychosis, bipolar disorder. Depression being most commonly the entry diagnosis of these 3, but it is rarely the first manifestation of mental health issues in that person's life. We talk about childhood temperament, early motor development, all being, not strongly, but decently related to later problems. The childhood disorders, oppositional defiant, ADHD, anxiety typically develops in childhood. There are already stronger links from these to the adult disorders, if you want. And the story is of childhood disorders is of what we call heterotypical continuity of different type. They were sometimes dismissed because they are children, they'll grow out of it. And when you look just at one disorder at a time, they often do. But when you look across, the childhood disorders are among the strongest predictors of mental illness, serious mental illness in adulthood. And once the major depression, psychosis, and bipolar disorder, especially the latter two, set in, the typical stories of chronicity and recurrence, and people are affected for decades. So aren't these early manifestations that have the potential to go away or to change, that are modifiable, the opportunity to do something much earlier? The other piece of context is family history. And we have seen that it changes a lot. It certainly changes when mental illness develops, number of years earlier in offspring of parents with living with serious mental illness. And I like to start this by this famous summary of the life work of Irv Gottesman, who started twin studies and family studies of schizophrenia from the 1950s, 1960s. And this chart shows that the likelihood of sharing the diagnosis of schizophrenia with a relative is proportional to the degree of biological relatedness. So it's highest in identical twins. If your identical twin has schizophrenia, your risk of schizophrenia is nearing 50%, 1 in 2, which is very different from the general population, or in absence of affected relatives, rate of 1%. And then the kind of in-betweens percentages, they roughly follow the degree of biological relatedness, of sharing the blood, of sharing the genes. And this is a powerful demonstration of genes being important. But when you look closely, it's equally powerful demonstration that genes are not the full story. If they were, the concordance in identical twins would be not 50%, but 100%. If they were, the concordance in all types of first-degree relatives, parents, siblings, children, and fraternal twins would be about the same. But it varies threefold, from 6 to 17%. Because these pairs of relatives share environment to different degrees. So the picture is also a very good demonstration of the role of environment and the malleability of our genetic disposition. I was interested how much of the family risk is specific to a type of illness and how much of it extends across types of illness. And to do that, almost 10 years ago, we completed a meta-analysis. The challenge was that most studies looked at one disorder at a time, or just a couple of disorders. We looked at parents affected by depression, parents affected by bipolar disorder, and parents affected by schizophrenia. And what is the risk of various disorders in their offspring? The blue highlighted numbers show the increase of risk in the same disorder that the parent is living with. If a parent is living with bipolar disorder, the risk of bipolar disorder in the offspring is about 10%, which is 5-fold increase from the roughly 2% risks of general population. And similar for schizophrenia, similar for depression. It's high. But the other numbers, the risk of depression or schizophrenia in the offspring of parents with bipolar disorder, are also increased. Not so many times increased, but still notably increased. And when we sum the risks of having a serious illness, the total risk is quite high. On average, about 1 in 3 offspring of parents with serious mental illness will develop a serious mental illness, which is a little bit too high to live with, really. When 2 parents are affected, it's 1 in 2. We in process of updating this meta-analysis and to be extending it to all kinds of disorders in parents and offspring, and there will be some confirmation, and some of the numbers actually look even higher, or show that, you know, the better we assess, the higher they look. And there will be some surprises with other types of disorders that may be actually thought of as less severe or less medical, and still carry similar degree of risk. There are also interesting tweaks and additional information that we can glean from family history. So these are recently published data from the entire of Sweden. So summary of 4 million lives, where they know the diagnoses from hospital admissions, so not all diagnoses, but the ones that sought treatment for not just the parent, but all relatives. And they produced the scores. And as we did see, they also saw that major depression is the typical gateway diagnosis, the typical first disorder of the major ones for which people seek treatment. But the family risk score, the proportion of relatives affected with a disorder, for example, psychosis, schizophrenia, correlates with the final diagnosis on the latest admission more than with the initial diagnosis. So it confirms the long-term kind of clinical knowledge that if a son or daughter of someone living with schizophrenia presents with depression, the likelihood that the depression will at some point turn into psychosis is relatively high. It may also matter which parent is affected. Except the X chromosome, we get the same amount of genes from our mom and our father. But in other ways, their roles in our life are very different. And we do see parents of origin effect. Overall, we see greater effect of mother being affected with mental illness than father. And that may be because motherhood is more ascertained with more certainty than fatherhood. But it's also probably because mother is the more key caregiver for more children. There's this parent with a disorder that's less common in their sex or gender. So when we look at ADHD, which is more common in males, if a mother is affected with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it signifies higher risk for her offspring than if a father is affected. The opposite with depression. Depression is more common in females. So if a father is affected with depression, it carries bigger risk to the offspring than if a mother is affected. And finally, there seem to be sex-specific parent of origin effects that in this figure I show for anxiety. And this may be because we're learning from parents that we closer to. And it's probably still more common on average that girls take their mom as a model and boys take their father as a model more often. Happens the other way around as well, but less often. And here we looked at anxiety, which parent has an anxiety disorder and what it means for the offspring. And you can see that when neither parent has anxiety, the risk for boys and girls is actually very low for both of them. If a mother has anxiety but not father, the risk is high for the daughters. And the boys catch up with the daughters or exceed the rate of daughters if both parents are affected. And as many family studies, we don't have complete information on fathers. We have 97% mothers assessed directly, but only about 70% of fathers. And mostly it is because the father is not in the household. And when there's no information on father, the risk of anxiety in the children is as high as is if both parents are affected by anxiety. So these data were kind of hard to work out because of the missing information. And it turned out that it was cleaner when we look at not is there a parent with anxiety, but is there a parent without anxiety in the household? So the best family determinant of whether a child will develop anxiety disorder was, is there a parent of the same gender who is not anxious present in the household. In other words, having an anxious father or having no father in the household turned out to carry the same level of risk of anxiety for boys. And having a non-anxious mother in the household is protective against anxiety for girls. Turning to genetics, family risk is often conflated with genetics, but I hope I showed enough to confirm that it is not. Nowadays, we can measure genetics very well and not quickly and inexpensively in genome-wide association studies. This is an example of genome-wide association study of bipolar disorder. 42,000 of people with bipolar disorder compared to 370,000 of people without a bipolar disorder. This is what it takes to discover 64 genetic loci, places in the genome where variants are definitely associated with bipolar disorder. We have even more of them for schizophrenia and for depression. And we really do need these huge samples because there are so many genes to test or so many genetic variants to test. But once we get this, we can sum all these genetic variants that bring a little bit of risk. And we can create scores, a total loading of genetic risk for bipolar disorder, for schizophrenia, for depression, for ADHD, that allow us to use molecular genetic information even in smaller and moderate-sized samples. We can also look at the degree of genetic relatedness between human features. And although this is busy, it's one of these pictures that I like because it shows human genetics in one page, and the lines going to the right, they show the total amount of genetic contribution to each trend, and the blue lines are based on twin studies and are inevitably longer. And the orange lines are based on the molecular genetic studies. And they are shorter than the twin ones, but they keep growing with how the size of the samples in genetic studies are growing. And the pie charts in the left part of the figure, they are the proportion of genetic contributions shared between each couple of traits. So when you look up bipolar disorder, which is the last but one, it's you can see that it shares a lot of, actually most of the genetic liability with schizophrenia, which is the last listed. But it also shares substantial degree with depression, but less so with ADHD. There's a whole list of factors that can be measured, including risk-taking. That's also associated with bipolar disorder, but not so much with depression. Genetically associated with this. And the number of sexual partners, which is associated with both of those before, and so on. And the genetics not just helps you predict, but it helps us understand the structure of causal relationship that's behind the manifestations of mental illness. Here's an example. This is a study we did together with a group based in Pittsburgh, most offspring of parents with bipolar disorder or control offspring. We created the genetic risk scores. We were warned that this is too small samples to work with anything genetic, but we got this beautiful gradation where offspring of healthy parents without any mood disorder had the lowest scores, followed by offspring of parents with bipolar disorder who did not develop any mood disorder, followed by offspring of healthy parents who did develop disorder, and then the highest scores in offspring of parents with bipolar disorder who also developed mood disorders themselves. And when we use it as a predictor, the polygenic scores for bipolar disorder in this case predicted which young people will develop bipolar disorder over and above knowing the diagnosis of parents. So they contributed over and above family history. broader look across diagnosis. This is now just published paper in actually the April issue of American Journal of Psychiatry, looking across the consortium, so across roughly 2,000 young people, including many offspring of parents with mental illness. In this case, we have more power, so we looked at 8 polygenic scores and used them as predictor, either on its own or controlled for family history, known family history of mental illness. And we got some confirmation and some surprises here. The confirmation was that the polygenic scores for the most typical disorders, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, they contributed, they predicted who develops these illnesses, but they also overlapped a lot with family history, as you would expect. The surprise was that the most predictive measure was polygenic score for neuroticism. In some way, a very common trait that includes, mild anxiety, but also being prone to boredom and being kind of self-conscious and sensitive to smells and all these things. And this has proven the strongest predictor of the most severe forms of mental illness. Part of the reasons why may be that it is really well measured. We have it measured in huge samples that are population-based. So the polygenic score was created with high accuracy. But it also brings interesting questions about the links between common everyday psychopathology and serious forms of mental illness. When we sum the effect of these 8 polygenic scores, they haven't exceeded or matched, but they came close to the predictive effect of knowing the full family history. And having the family history and the polygenic scores gives us the most accurate prediction. So we're not saying this is ready for use, but we believe that that molecular genetic is approaching usability in early identification of risk and selection of people for early interventions. Especially the trend for smaller families and more children growing up without links to their birth parents. The information that's available for family history is often more and more often missing or smaller. I'll turn to the last part of prediction that I want to go into, and that's antecedents, the early manifestations of psychopathology. I'm specifically interested in antecedents that are transdiagnostic, that predict more than one form of mental illness. And based on a lot of literature reviewing, we picked 4. Affective lability, tendency to rapid changes in mood or emotions that are either unexpected or out of proportion to anything in the environment. Anxiety, psychotic-like experiences or psychotic symptoms outside the context of psychotic illness, and basic symptoms. Also uncommon, unusual experiences that sometimes involve the loss of ability, like I kind of couldn't understand for a moment. It was strange. And come with such kind of realization. And we tested all 4 of these in the 4-bow cohort. And as I mentioned, we had 86 young people with onsets of major mood or psychotic disorders. And those who had an antecedent on previous year's assessment were much more likely to develop an onset than those who did not have either of those 4 antecedents. The rate per 1,000 increased about 7-fold, almost 8-fold. But we need to correct this for age because the antecedents are becoming more common with age, and so does the onset of mental illness. So that's why the hazard ratio is not 8-fold, but it's 4-fold. Still very strong effect. Having one of these, affective lability, anxiety, psychotic or basic symptoms, increasing significantly the risk of onset of mood or psychotic disorders. We look at them individually, and anxiety was by far the strongest predictor, trumping the psychotic and symptoms, affective lability, basic symptoms, and being almost as strong as any antecedents. So the question rose, is it worth assessing all four? And the answer is actually yes, because having multiple of these antecedents is where the risk really increases up to about 20% in those who have all four of them. And when we compare this to the anxiety alone, we see that having a combination of 3 or 4 exceeds the risk for anxiety alone and really picks the highest risk individuals. We also had the opportunity to look at this at population level. Here we were limited to diagnoses, and we picked ADHD as a externalizing or neurodevelopmental disorder, and we picked anxiety disorder that were both available in the whole Denmark registry, and we looked at those two as predictors of bipolar disorder in adulthood. And in registries, the rates are low and the odds are high, the relative risks are high. So having either ADHD or anxiety predicted about 10-fold increase in the risk of bipolar disorder. This is typically hospital-admitted bipolar disorder. But having both of them at some point in childhood increased the risk, what? 60-fold? No, 30-fold. 60 is the absolute. So children who have both anxiety and ADHD at some point in their childhood are at very high risk of bipolar disorder. We repeated these analyses for schizophrenia, and they look almost exactly the same. So we looked at family history. We saw the higher risk in offspring of parents with serious mental illness. This is now back to data from the consortium, and the separation starts very early and continues through the developmental age range. On average, about 2-fold increase in risk. But how does this tally with the antecedents? Does the presence of anxiety or ADHD in childhood actually, does its predictive effect depend on family history? So that's something we'll be looking at now. And so this is bringing family history of mental illness and anxiety earlier in childhood together. And you can see a gradation. And in this gradation, the presence of anxiety in childhood kind of trumps the family history. We see the highest risk in children who have parents living with mental illness and who also had anxiety in childhood, very high risk. They surpass the 50% mark of risk for mental illness around the age of 19. Then followed by children with anxiety disorder, even when they don't have family history, also very high risk of major mental illness, mostly depression in this case, followed by children at family high risk without anxiety, and then of course lowest risk, very low risk actually, in children who don't have affected parents and do not have anxiety in childhood. This is for ADHD, also related, but here the family history trumps the ADHD. So in some ways, a little bit weaker. Or you can say that ADHD only has predictive role in the presence of positive family history, because family history with and without anxiety separate very clearly at age 19. The ADHD makes difference from 30 to 45%, so about 1.5 times the risk among people with family history. But among those without family history, the ADHD does not add that much to the risk. And I'll stop here with epidemiological prediction, and I'm very keen to add objective measurement, to have predictors that don't depend on what people choose to tell us, whether it's young people or parents. And one of the biomarkers we're working with is speech. And even like 1 minute of speech has such a huge amount of information in it. It's the acoustic quality, the sound of speech, the rhythm and melody of speech, as well as what people choose to say and how it is connected in their speech. Beyond speech, of course, brain activity is an obvious place to look at. Brain is where mental illness starts, but we're also looking at actigraphy. at movement and sleep over time. And we focusing on speech and actigraphy because they are scalable. When we try to bring young people into the scanner, when we're lucky, we get 2/3 of them come. But when we ask them to record 1 minute of speech, we get 95%. So they may not be as fancy, but they do give us objective measurement of movement, speaking, thinking in real time for the vast majority of people that we are interested in. There's also associated features that we wouldn't have thought of in the first place, but that are proving important. This is body mass index. We know there's an association between serious forms of mental illness and obesity or higher body mass in adulthood, but where does it start? And when we look at across time, the interesting answer is it kicks in right with puberty. Around age 11 is when girls at high family risk for mental illness, their BMI is exceeding their peers. And interestingly, they're more on the thinner side before puberty. So there's this developmental effect in weight development that kicks in about 5 years before the typical age of onset of the major mental illness. This graph is only based on those who have not had onset at that time. Last, I'll turn to bringing things together. Multivariate prediction, like we had so many types of variables. We have family history, we have genetic measures, we have clinical antecedents, earlier diagnoses, we have possibly a host of biomarkers. How can we use all the available information? And a number of smart people have tried to do it, and we have increasingly sophisticated methods of doing it right. And some of this has been published as risk calculators. That's multivariate prediction brought into a human usable form, and some of them show very promising results. Here's one created for bipolar disorder, where you can see that the ratio between what they call converters and non-converters, between people who did and who did not develop major mood disorder, is remarkably different at the edges, at the people who score very low and very high on the score. In between, I mean, there's a gradation, but at the edges, it's fairly accurate. And the symptoms in this, they are all kind of answers to clinical questions. They are not difficult to obtain. So something very, very usable, potentially. This is another risk calculator also in bipolar disorder. And here the added thing was an attempt to replicate in a new sample. And to be honest, it didn't replicate very well. There was this drop in accuracy when you transfer the prediction into a new sample. It was kind of aiming high. The new samples came from different countries. It was not designed as a replication study. The assessments occurred in different ways, but it did not quite match the prediction in the original sample. But the one thing that we see across both the original prediction in red and the replication prediction in black with gray shading is they both increasing towards the right. They're increasing with age. And this is a trend that we've seen across multivariate predictions, that they become more accurate as people are getting older. But now the age on the right, it's over 20. And we have seen that the average age at onset is 16, 17, at least in family high-risk sample. So with this current type of calculators, by the time we are able to predict, it may be nearly too late. And I think that's another reason to try to bring the objective biomarkers that don't depend on what people can or won't tell us, and that may actually be available earlier. That's why I'm excited about the genes that we can get from as early as few weeks into pregnancy. And for example, the BMI work that shows the effect kicks in at age 11. Here's another example. This one comes from Brazil, very large population-based cohort, high-quality assessment. It comes from the Pelotas cohort. And here the results are presented in the ROC curve shaped. So the curves, the closer they get to the top left corner, the better the prediction. And you can see that the blue one does get reasonably close to the top left corner. It provides a good prediction, but all the other ones don't. Well, the difference, the blue one is age 18. The red one is age 15. So age 15, they're not able to predict anything. Age 18, they can. And unfortunately, in this cohort, I don't see enough guarantee that some of the onsets were not already there at age 18, because they all only started using the diagnostic interviews with adults. But it's a third manifestation that the current level of prediction, although it works, it kind of works with the older young people. Here's a summary of evidence across various multivariate models and risk calculators predicting depression, bipolar disorder, or psychosis. The common metrics is area under the curve that comes from the ROC curve type of representation, or HARC. And they vary, and some of them get into the 80s, which for many people suggest is a reasonable threshold for clinical applicability. I'm especially excited about the recent work by Kotsolaris in the Pronia consortium. That's a very complex piece of work that actually did bring together the objective. And interestingly, they found that the kind of human prediction and automated prediction complement each other. So the humans had a high degree of specificity, and the computer and biomarker-based prediction had high degree of sensitivity. When they brought them together in this cohort, they got this high predictive accuracy. In this case, the number is actually balanced accuracy rather than area under the curve. That's the metric they chose to report, but it is very impressive, and it's the best believable prediction of psychosis that I have seen so far. So with that, I would like to summarize and conclude. I believe we can say that the onsets of major mood and psychotic disorders are reasonably predictable. They don't come out of the blue. Family history, molecular genetics, pathological antecedents, prior diagnoses, and biomarkers seem to add non-redundant information. So bringing them together really seems to be the way forward. The reproducibility, being able to move them from one place to other, that's still work in progress. And so is the kind of delay from which we can predict, because we see a reasonably accurate prediction from just before in short time scale and with older young people. But looking at, prediction that would give us multi-year time window to intervene, and that would allow us to intervene before psychosocial impairment, educational delay, and puts people at disadvantage. That's where we need to go. From our work, it also looks like the targeted early interventions are feasible. We are working on them, and we're getting a good level of acceptability. We have over 80% people not just accepting, but also completing the early interventions we offering them. That's work in progress. I didn't show the data today, but that's what we see. So it comes down what next. I have harked about objective markers and the need for objective and bring them in for a bit. But there's also the need to integrate the specific and transdiagnostic, some of the more accurate models that depend on the very recent, just before onset information are specific to a particular diagnosis. But the transdiagnostic models, including the antecedents that we looked at, seem to work from further distance and may allow earlier prediction. And finally, I think we need to move from just predicting illness and predicting who is at risk, who needs a intervention, and start thinking of predicting which intervention is needed. for which person. I really think the whole like personalized medicine, it would have much better chance at the early stages before the brain and body and lives are ravaged by the effects of illness and attempted and failed treatments. So really getting it right at the first try, and ideally getting it right at the preventive stage has bigger potential. So I'll stop here. Another disclosure here. You have seen largely human-generated presentation, and I have many people and funders to thank, and to making it possible. The work that I presented, especially across the consortium, it's probably the work of more than 100 dedicated researchers. Not all of them are listed on this slide. But thank you so much for listening. I would be very happy to take any comments and questions. Yes.
Thank you very much, Thank you very much, Rudolf. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. It was a great, excellent talk and fantastic captive audience as well. So we're going to have questions on Zoom as well as here. We'll start with the audience here for questions. And then if there's a question on Zoom, Rudolf, if you can read the question out to the audience, that'd be great.
If I see it, I'll read it.
Definitely. Rida Jupiter.
First of all, thank you very much for this presentation and for coming. Lena, we share something in common. Both names end with A, and I am also very often mistaken for Madame Rida Joubert. So
I thought it was we share in common.
Okay.
So kind.
I think I would like to, first of all, make some kind of historical comments on what happened here at the Douglas Hospital. I think 25 years ago, the Beck family reached out to Dr. Sam Lal, who passed away, and who was at that time the head of the Schizophrenia Research Access. And they said, we want to give to mental health. Can you help us? And Dr. Sam Lal was very instrumental in bringing the Beck family to the Douglas Hospital. And basically from that time, it was a great partnership. I would like to thank them because actually a big part of my career is due to the Beck family, because when they gave the first chair in genetics to Guy Rouleau at that time, I was a student of Guy, and Guy basically, with the money given by the Beck family, has been able to hire both myself and Gustavo Turecki to the Douglas Hospital and establish the genetic research lab here. So thank you very much for your help and for your support for mental health. I think I will also seize this occasion to thank very generously my friend and my mentor, Ashok Mala. I think it was, I mean, at that time when we started the PEP program, actually it was before Ashok came to the Douglas, and I said to myself, what should I do now? I'm here, I'm doing genetics. I probably better do genetics of first episode schizophrenia because they have not been exposed to antipsychotic medication and so on, and that would be probably the way to go there. And I started my venture here at the Douglas Hospital by doing genetics of schizophrenia. And then Ashok came, and basically he came in the context of advising us how to do first episode program from PEP Montreal. And since then, so since 2003, it was 20 years of extraordinary journey. I learned a lot. And I was kind of very biologically oriented psychiatrist, and I think I learned a lot from the clinical intervention and the early intervention and the approach to early intervention from Ashok. Now, let me basically, I think I have written recently an editorial. Basically, the title, Psychiatry is the Flagship of Individualized and Personalized Medicine. But I have a bit of a different perspective on that. And I took that from one genome-wide association study of height in humans. And basically, this genome-wide association study assembled, I think, 1.2 million people. And they have done a genome-wide association study, and they came to the conclusion that they have a saturated map of all the variants that contribute to height. So it's to height, you know. So it's a very simple phenotypic trait. And they came to the conclusion that there are probably 5,000 variants that are involved. And with all that genetic information, when they do some prediction, that prediction doesn't surpass what I call the surface phenotype, that is the phenotype of the parents. If you take the mid phenotypes of the parents, it's much more accurate than the whole biological data set that they have. So I thought that there is probably some kind of limit to what we can achieve with biological and with actually all kind of, what we call marker in psychiatry. I think we have some kind of basically rich surface phenotypes that we can work with. You have cited some of them in early childhood, but there are so many, people who have language disorder, people who have motor activity problems, people who have learning disability, all of these people, I think we can do a tremendous work of universal prevention or some kind of indicative prevention in that kind of population. But I'm asking also myself, if I have all the monozygotic twins who have one member who has schizophrenia and the other doesn't, what should we offer to the other member who has a risk of 50 times increased compared to the general population? So I know that the risk is 50 times increased. I'm not going to ask these people to go for some phenotyping and some markers and stuff like that. I will tell them, if you have problems, come and see us. And when you come and see us, you will find someone to listen immediately. And when you go to the emergency because you have a problem, you will not receive, a traumatic experience at the emergency. And when you are evaluated, you don't wait for another 6 months to receive treatment, and so on and so forth. So I think we have challenges that are clinically extremely important, and we need to face that. That not saying that we don't need to do this kind of work. I think we need still to keep scaffolding our knowledge about the biology of motor disorder, but I think there is a very big work to do in terms of what needs to be offered here and now to patients. Thank you.
Yeah, I try to pick the parts that are kind of more of a question. And I'll just pick a couple of things. I start with the twins because I think that's a good example, right? Indeed, if you have a monozygotic twins, you have your genetic mirror image, and it's fairly likely that you come to the same outcomes in life, whether it comes to schizophrenia or other things. But if you go by the diagnosis of your co-twin, you only learn about the risk when you are actually already old enough to be already affected. The difference is that the genetic test we can have at birth and now before birth. So it's an information that's objective and that we can obtain sooner, much sooner, with plenty of time to do something. The other part of my answer would touch on the height GWAS. The biggest genome-wide association study looked at human heights. Well, of course, human height is highly genetic, but it's also very easy to measure. And that means that the family trait measure is very accurate. And that's not something we have in mental illness. And we seem to be faring better in the relative effect of the polygenic scores and the family history, because we are closely approaching the effect of family history. We haven't matched it yet, but it was 4.2 versus 3.7% variance explained. We close to matching it with fractions of the sample size that was obtained for height. And with some disorders in particular, like ADHD, the polygenic scores based on very modest sample size are very consistently predictive. So it does depend on the genetic structure of each phenotype, how good the contribution of that test will be. And lastly, we will not be using polygenic scores in isolation. We'll be using them together with other type of information, but they are one part of the information that we can get early in life And that makes them a very valuable ingredient in what we do.
Somebody else? No. Thanks. It really was, as usual, just a wonderful review of the literature and your own work. I just have a couple of comments. I think at the very beginning, you showed a slide where the message was that the universal prevention loses its effect. I think part of the reason for that is the universal prevention is really not that universal, because it's very limited what you do in schools and so on. Universal prevention would mean more green spaces, less urban density, reduction of poverty, and those will have effects for all kinds of health problems, but we don't have that. That's why the effect is lost very quickly. The second comment had to do with, I noticed that when you look at family history of various disorders, substance abuse is not included. When we looked at our relatively small PEP sample, I don't know if Pia is here, but a number of years ago, in fact, we found the same as you did, that psychosis and bipolar disorder, there was a large overlap, but a large percentage of these families had substance abuse disorder in parents. So I'm just wondering how, and it happens also in service delivery, we're separating these two all the time, and yet they are so clearly integrated. I can't now remember what the third one.
I'll try the first two, and the third one will come back, I'm sure. The first one, I completely agree with you. The universal interventions that were delivered in randomized design and therefore qualified for this review were typically very lightweight, school-based psychological interventions. They were the typical of, we do something with the whole classroom and it's like 2 sessions of something. So there's very little delivered, and it certainly doesn't reach out to the environment in the way you outlined. And that there's also actually some evidence within these that the generic mental health directed, well-meant in universal intervention may prove somewhat harmful for the small segment of kids at the highest risk, possibly through feeling singled out, or this is not relevant to me, or something like that. So that all comes into there, and I take that comment in full. The other question about the substance use, we did not do it in the 10-year ago meta-analysis, but we have it in the one that will be published later this year. And there certainly are effects, and they are not as large as for like parent depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, for these type of outcomes in children. It's also a difficult part of literature to bring together, because the substance use literature is very mixed, except alcoholism. So all the other substances, like one study is just mothers dependent on opiates, another study is just fathers cocaine. Like bringing them, there's not enough of any one of these kinds, and bringing them all together does bring a large degree of heterogeneity. So we have the data, and I'm kind of less happy about it, but then the core, but it is the status of the knowledge right now. Thank you.
Hi. On the topic of biological or objective markers, excuse me, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
On the topic of objective markers, I found the figure that you showed on BMI, the change in BMI, and the age and the risk. I find it quite interesting that you're finding this association, but are there any BMI associated markers that you have looked at or are interested in looking at to kind of look further into this objective marker prediction? And And my second question, I apologize for the two, is have you observed any cardiac associated not diseases, but I'm particularly interested in the younger cohorts. So cardiac associated symptoms that are altered in the at-risk groups.
Okay, so we have two questions that are kind of linked because they both about the interface between physical and mental health, and in particular about objective markers that may be associated with the peripubertal weight increase that we have seen in offspring of parents with major mood disorders. On the first part of the question about the BMI associated biomarkers, the ones we are looking at are insulin tolerance versus insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance, and also C-reactive protein, which is a marker of systemic inflammation that's relatively stable across times of days. And I don't have the answers, partly because of how finicky the measures are. So like the insulin resistance, we need people fasting in the morning, and it requires blood tests rather than just saliva. So it's kind of harder to get. And the numbers we have in those studies are both smaller, and also it's more selected. And that's sometimes where we limited in actually being able to look into the biomarkers. So often what ends up being analyzed, it's the function of what we are able to get from nearly everybody. But yeah, that's about where my knowledge ends. Like for the cardiac specific, I don't know enough about it, but I know Ben Goldstein and his group at CAMH are looking at vascular health, including early on in the course of individuals at risk, and there's good amount to suggest that like the quality of the vasculature and the leakage from vessels in the brain may differentiate it even at those early stages. Again, it's an early stage research. I only know it indirectly, and it's based on smaller selected samples. So that's all I know. But thank you. I think it's a very important field that probably will expand over the next decade.
I think we'll do Zoom questions now.
Zoom questions. There's 25 people on the Zoom. There are 3 questions. You can take a look.
Oh, yes. We should scroll up in this, yes. I guess.
Let me go to the first one. That's the first one. We'll read them out, please.
So the first question I get, we get through the online chat. I follow teens with depression. What is the time delay for progression from depression to bipolar or psychosis, months or years? What frequency of follow-up would be useful to screen for hypomanic and pre-psychotic symptoms? So that's a good clinical question. If someone develops depression, first onset of depression, for how long do we need to be vigilant to this turning into bipolar disorder? And I have much more of the answer for bipolar disorder, where the risk remains significant for decades, but is concentrated in the first about 4 years. So the risk is initially about 4% per year, and then it decreases down to about 1% per year. So I don't let my guards down, especially when we're starting new antidepressant or antidepressant that has more noradrenergic activating component, or an antidepressant as a with stimulant. But the first several years after diagnosis are associated with high risk of conversion. For psychosis, the literature is more in months. So it's about the rate of depression in the development of psychosis is highest in the prodromal range and in the first year post onset. So what we know is more about months than about years, but I don't know enough about longer term follow-ups. Psychosis being a less common outcome, we would need larger data about that. And it's nice to see this filtering down to very kind of clinically based topics. Should I go to the next one here? Yeah, well, this is a continuation. Should pediatric psychiatrists be allowed to follow patients until age 25? Should this allow teens to continue to be followed by someone who knows their history and has established therapeutic alliance with them when they are at a period of high risk of developing serious mental illness? These are very good points towards the youth mental health that we have experts on here. I don't have an opinion on whether it needs to be a pediatric psychiatrist, but I absolutely do believe that it is much preferable if there's continuity to care across the kind of 18 years old, 19 years old transition that tends to be a turbulent point in people's life anyway. And there may be an argument for child and adolescent professionals to continue longer, and there may be equally compelling argument for either adult professionals starting earlier or for youth professionals to span the youth age range, which may be the strongest of the three. Shall we go to Professor Romina Mizrahi's comment? Hey, great talk, thank you. I wonder about your thoughts on the best predictors for resilience, for mental illness, and or each individual disorders. Merci. Well, thank you, Romina. So resilience is an interesting concept that I may not know enough about, but we've tried to define a resilient outcome as the combination of absence of major mental illness with good functioning, and when we look at the predictors, it looks like very close to the reverse of what we get with mental illness. So the family history negatively predicts resilience. The antecedents negatively predict resilience. We also have a resiliency questionnaire that I find very difficult to separate from actual psychopathology and social support. So we kind of try to get something out of it. And I'm also very curious. I trained with Michael Rutter, who was very much proponent of the definition of resilience that takes environmental adversity and situation into account. And in that view, of course, we don't learn about resilience until someone goes through a challenging period in their lives. And I am very reluctant to do what many do, and that's to automatically consider living with affected parent as adversity, because what we see is very good childcare provided in families where a parent is living with serious forms of mental illness. And we've seen it also during the COVID pandemic, when there were concerns if kids are at home, no school, how will the kids of parents with serious mental illness fare? They fared better than the kids of parents without mental illness. And so I don't really think we are anywhere near at having the resilience in its most sophisticated definition, and that's of how people fare growing up in the face of major adversity. But thank you, Romina, for bringing the topic. Ian.
Need a microphone, that's okay. Connected with all sorts of very great talk. So my question is, looking at things through the lens of functioning, I guess,
Yes.
and you talked
Yes.
a lot about maybe, a diagnosis.
Yes.
How would that change the predictive ability
Yes.
of the indicators that you're looking at? And do you have an idea of how it might impact the effectiveness of prevention? If you looked at those who are struggling with functioning a larger group than just the diagnosis.
I'll try to repeat partly. The question is about functioning and functioning possibly as a predictor of how people do or how young people do, both as a prognosis and with interventions. And I am also thinking about functioning as the actual outcome that matters the most, and that's what you had on mind as well. So we look at functioning in the established way, and that's Columbia impairment scales and how kids are doing. And again, it's that one is highly correlated with current psychopathology. So like when we look at that and at the symptoms of depression and anxiety, it feels like looking at the same thing. So I was a little bit disappointed with that as a definite separate outcome. It separates easier from psychosis, less well from depression. So we also trying to track functioning it in a much more kind of real life approach. So as the young people are growing up, we asking them about events and milestones typical for their age. So these are things like, if you are 16, are you doing your driver's license? Have you done a summer job? Have you done a placement? Have you started an intimate relationship? Then it comes to moving to live independently from parents and getting a first paid job or full-time job, and of course completing education. And it's the milestones that I do find are the kind of even more real outcome than the diagnosis of mental illness. Because if someone develops major depression, right, that can still go so many ways. And if they complete their qualifications and education to their potential and start family and have a full-time job and are managing to hold it, then I'm very happy with that outcome. And it's a new way of looking at it. It's kind of multiple points on a expected journey through life. And with the Forbo cohort being 15-year-old on average, I don't feel we there yet to show these outcomes, and but it's one of the aspects of it that I'm just very, very curious about. We also testing the early interventions. The outcomes we know now are symptom scores a few months later and a year later. And again, that's not what really matters, but whether we will see the effects of the early psychological interventions that we're doing on completion of education, employability, relationships. That's what really matters. So I think it's just such an important aspect of this work to always bring in. And it's remarkable how little of it is done. And here I believe actually the psychosis field is a little bit ahead of time. And when I was looking for like employment and additional outcomes for mood disorders, I am finding less. So yeah.
We're right on time. Thank you very much, Rudolf. Please join me in thanking Rudolf once more.